Hello, my name is Audrey Amrine Beardsley. I'm a professor at Arizona State University, and I'm also the host of a show that we sponsor at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College called Inside the Academy, during which we interview members of the National Academy of Education. And today we have the honor of interviewing Dr. Lauren Resnick here at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you, Dr. Resnick, for agreeing to be interviewed. And so we have some sections of this show, the first of which we're going to talk a little bit about your personal background, and we call that section Becoming Lauren. And so if you tell us about your childhood, where were you born, your parents, etc.
Well, I was born in the mid-30s in New York City, child of the children of immigrants on both sides. Very politically active family. Now keep me going, if that's what you want.
From where did your parents immigrate?
My grandparents.
Grandparents,
were immigrants
okay.
from Eastern Europe, which is where Jewish people mostly came from.
Okay.
And they came in the 1890s.
What did your parents do?
My parents both were college educated, but my grandparents were both only semi-literate. I mean, all four of them, actually, were only semi-literate. Nevertheless, one of them became a major player in New York City real estate. And the other was actually something of a politician. He founded Jewish farming communities in various parts of the country. When you might know, or some people who watch this might know, that Israel was founded in part on the purchase of land and the founding of farming communities, starting in the late 19th century and running right up through the 1940s. But some people didn't think that should be done in Israel. I thought it should be done in places in the world that really welcomed visitors, needed the land to be farmed and developed, and didn't have the likelihood of wars over
land,
which we know about now, right?
Right.
So there was a small crowd of them. I know 10 or 15 names. I'm sure there were 2 or 3 times that number, who founded these farming communities in way out deserted places, either in the American West or in Latin America, even 1 or 2 in Africa. And so my father grew up on one of those. And that set a life course that would be very different from almost everybody else. And the community failed because they didn't know how to negotiate water rights. We can hear about that problem in the news these days.
Sure.
But even though they didn't negotiate their water rights very well, they were very American, and they were immigrants, but they were very American, and that meant mixing with your neighbors, whoever they were. So very strong relationships were founded with the people in Utah, who mostly were Mormons.
Okay.
I don't know if you know it, but the Mormons have something in their tradition that links them to Jews on paper. But that actually probably played a role in the welcome that they got.
Okay.
And so that was an unusual upbringing. So he grew up till the age of 15 or so in Utah. And then moved to Detroit for a while, which is when his parents divorced. And eventually ended up in the first class of the UCLA that was on the new campus in the middle of the city.
Oh, goodness.
So that's his background. And then he eventually came back to New York to represent Western farmers as food began to be shipped across the country. So he was I suppose you'd say the middleman, but he considered himself a representative of the farmers, and took his children to the farmers' meetings every summer, which were held here and there across the country, dotted across the country in the farming region. So that was my childhood.
So how do you think that part of your childhood has influenced the person you've become today, in terms of a person, but also in terms of an academic?
Well, I don't think it led to the academic part, but it definitely led to a sense that this country, with all its diversity, has been able to not just get along, but make deep friendships across the boundaries of what looked like, on paper sometimes, like fighting groups. So that has affected my life in a lot of deep ways.
Tell us about your experiences as a student in schools.
Well, I was one of those kids who didn't have to think hard to get all the honors in high school. And so when it came time to apply to college, which there was no question about in my family, my parents knew that the Ivy Leagues were the place to go. And I also had an inkling that maybe a Jewish kid from New York wasn't going to get into the Ivy Leagues, which would have been true up until the year before I was applying. And in fact, the counselor, the person in the high school who helped students apply to college. This was a school with quite a few Jewish kids in it, but it wasn't majority Jewish.
Was this a public school?
It was a public high school.
Okay.
But she called my parents and me in for a conversation about applying for school, and she said to my parents something like, she will not get into this list of schools that you've laid out here except by a rare chance, because they don't take Jews in those schools.
Interesting.
And my father got very angry. I can remember his visceral reaction. And she said, she can apply to those and I'll work with you to get all the references that you need, but I'd like to sponsor her for my alma mater, which is just below Ivy League status. And the name of that school will come to me, I suppose, but that calmed my father down, because he knew then that he wasn't dealing with somebody who was herself an anti-Semite.
Sure.
And accepted that offer, but said he still was going to have his daughter apply to the others. Well, it turned out, we now know it from research that's been published, that was the year that most of the Ivy Leagues decided to change their policy and to take students in by their college board score, not by their ethnicity, or at least not totally by their ethnicity and who they knew. So I got into all the Ivy Leagues. Because not too many people were applying. I mean, you can see how in the immediate changeover period, they were going to take probably everybody who had applied. All of my high school friends who were similar to me also got into all the colleges they applied to. They all went to them. So, and that landed me at Harvard. It was called Radcliffe. The women's section was called Radcliffe at the time.
Is that right?
Right at the point when it was really becoming intellectually exciting. Harvard was deciding at that moment to become an intellectual leader, which it always had been, but much more broadly, and not limited to preparing pastors. I don't know that they actually were preparing pastors. They still have a very active divinity school, but it specializes in comparative religion. I have great people there. I know some of them. It's very different from what you might imagine as a divinity school. So I arrived there at a time when the faculty were just thrilled to have exciting students and
diverse students.
And diverse students. Well, there were only, I believe, 3 black students, and Harvard and Radcliffe combined at that time. I'm not going to name them, but all of them were friends of mine. So that barrier was going to take another period of time.
Sure. This
to
is
overcome.
1957, isn't
Yeah.
this when you started?
54.
Oh,
actually,
okay.
yeah.
So you graduated probably around 1957.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was very mixed population, but not racially.
Sure.
And there were some foreign students. I think I probably knew all of them. It was a very exciting time to be a student, and you could walk into any professor's office, and if you bothered to read something they had written before walking in there, you would get
even better
a real welcome. They would argue with you, etc. So that's what my college years were like.
What did you go to Harvard aspiring to become?
Well, I aspired to be a musician, so I signed up but my parents, I think, understanding that I was a decent but not great musician, said, okay, do music, but do it at a school where you won't have to transfer if you change your mind. So that's how I ended up at Harvard instead of one of the major music academies.
What was the instrument that you played?
Mostly piano, also flute, and a bunch of things, and some singing. Yeah, I was doing a lot of things. But 6 months in, I realized that my fellow students were hearing things in the music that was being played or performed that I would eventually hear, but I didn't hear right away. Some of the chord structures and even the rhythmic structures, they were easier for me, but chord structures, I couldn't always repeat difficult passages singing them or something, and they could. So I went to see the head of the department, which was, as usual, wide open to a student at that time.
Sure.
And he said, yeah, we've noticed that too.
Oh.
And he said, look, you're welcome to remain as a student with us. We love having you. It was a very small department. It was really great. We love having you. But you're probably not going to be one of the great performers or composers of your generation. So you should decide what you want, and why don't you minor in music?
Okay.
If you choose not to stay as a major. And that's what I did. And then I looked around and studied history for a while, and then it became history and literature, which was a sort of, for anybody who wasn't going for a science degree, that was a common thing at the time.
And then you stayed there for
Then I
all
stayed
degrees.
there because I met my husband as I was about to graduate, and he said, could you stay on here, and then maybe we could get married in a year or so. And
Done.
So I stayed, and I had to look around for, I said, okay, I'll stay for 1 year, but then you need to move with me. I can't remember exactly.
Sure.
We could reconstruct this together, but I don't remember the details.
Sure.
But so I stayed, and I had to look at the last minute, late in June, for where I could fruitfully stay. And the School of Education offered me a fellowship for some teaching program that they had. So that's what I did.
Okay. So then you got a degree in teaching first?
Yeah. And then I went looking for a teaching job because I had decided, okay, I'll stay in Boston. We're getting married. And he was a PhD student. And I went looking for jobs, all very well supported by the School of Education. And at the end of several very nice interviews, the head of the school would put down his papers and say, you know, you're really good, but we can't hire you. Why? Because you're a woman. So you'll probably get pregnant and leave.
You're kidding.
And I said, no. I mean, I probably will get pregnant, but I'll just need a little time off, and then I'll come back. We couldn't have a married woman with a baby as a teacher. That would give the wrong message to our girls. And this happened in 2 or 3 schools, different versions of it.
Sure.
So it began to be clear that I was not going to be able to pursue a career at that time as a great teacher in the public schooling system of the Boston area. So I went back to see my advisors in the School of Education, and I said, we were afraid of this. There's another person who's getting the same results. that person turned out to be Pat Graham, who
Oh, you're kidding.
yeah, she and I have shared
experiences.
Yeah, and
Sure.
they said, listen, you better enroll as a graduate student. By the time you're finished, probably most of this stage of not wanting women will be over. And in any case, you'll have a degree where you can go to wherever the opportunities are. So they set that up for me. And that's what I did.
So you enrolled in the Harvard Graduate School to get an EDD, is that correct?
Right, yeah, had to be an EDD because they
And-
weren't allowed at that time.
Right. No PhDs at that point.
Right.
And still even, I think, today, isn't that right?
I'm not sure.
I'm not
I don't
sure.
know.
Okay. And so what did you end up studying for your dissertation?
Well, you know, I should have known you were going to ask me that, and I can hardly remember because it's gotten lost in so
In the
many
other
other interesting
projects.
things that I've done. What I know about the 4 years there, was it 4? Yeah, 4 or 5, is that I looked at all the most challenging possibilities that I could. So my official advisor was a scholar, was a polymath. He was on the faculty as a statistician.
Okay.
But he was also a linguist of the time, so there's a different kind of linguistics than now. And he fluently spoke and wrote several languages, including Chinese and several others, and was very interested in language learning. And I worked with him. I stayed with him, even though it was pretty clear to me that I wasn't going to become a statistician. But he said, if you're with me, you have to learn all the statistics. And we still do them by hand. He wouldn't let his students do computerized statistical stuff. So I had to do all those things, which I'm very pleased that I did,
Sure.
even though I didn't go on to specialize. But it means I can talk to the statisticians and really understand them.
Sure, sure.
And I did a dissertation. You'll have to come back to me on this. I
That's
didn't
okay.
prepare for it. It's on my CV somewhere, so I could go and look at it. You probably have it. It just isn't where I ended up
Sure.
working.
It's one of your formative
Yeah, right.
experiences, but you moved past that. So
I
then,
didn't try to publish it. Probably could have, but I
Sure,
didn't try.
sure. After that, you became a teacher at the American School of Paris?
Now that was inside it.
Okay.
That my husband wanted to go to Paris for a year or two to do his archival research. He was doing some work in French history.
Okay.
And I said I'd go, and I got a job while I was there as a teacher. See, they didn't care
Right,
that I
right.
was a woman. And,
Potentially having children.
right. And I taught there. That was a lot of fun.
What did you teach? What subject
I
areas?
taught 9th grade social studies.
Okay.
So that was pretty general, whatever the curriculum was. And they were mostly American students, some French students, their parents having discerned that opportunities would lie in America, and going to the American school was good for their children.
Oh, sure.
So that
Right.
was fun too. So I got to know some of the French families as well as all the American families. It was a very close-knit crowd. You have to think of this as being in
61? I have 61.
Yeah, right in there, where France was just recovering from the war.
Oh, sure.
And French families of education and means were recognizing that they might have to send their children off to some other countries for part of their education. What better way than getting them into an English-speaking school,
Sure.
et cetera. That was the thing. And they were all very interesting, and the Americans were interesting. It was partly business companies that were growing in Paris, and partly military people and others interested in the political relationships between America and
Especially
France.
at the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then
It was
you
a-
came back after that, and did
We
you go
had
back
one
to
more
Harvard?
year at Harvard.
Oh, at Harvard. And
Yeah.
that was as a researcher, is that correct?
Yeah, I was Fred Skinner's first education postdoc. but he didn't like me very much because I also spent time with Jerry Bruner.
Oh, really?
And
they didn't like that. Or he didn't like that.
neither of them liked each other very much.
Is that right?
And, but Bruner, I mean, Fred, he was a brilliant
Right.
scholar, and he was pushing the limits of the Würzburg School of knowledge and learning, which is made up of bits. I call it bits and pieces psychology, which is very much alive still, and has done some great things. But he was doing that, and he didn't really have a plan for me. So, which is also mostly how it works with postdocs.
Sure, sure.
So I did what I wanted, and Jerry's world was much more engaging for me.
Okay.
So
those are pretty phenomenal primary mentors for you.
yeah. And Jerry, I tried to bring the two together. Jerry at one point said, you know, I didn't really want you in this seminar, but it's been interesting. You're really trying to bring these two worlds together. How about writing a paper that expresses all of this? And send it to me, and if it's any good, I'll help you get it published. I'm even going to edit a book, and maybe will belong in that book. So I worked on that paper, partly in the hospital having babies, stuff like that.
Sure.
And
It's on the side.
yeah, and then I sent it to him. He said, this is really good, but I'm not editing the book anymore. So you're on your own. I suggest the Harvard Educational Review, which was a very prestigious place to publish at the time. But it was student edited. I had been an editor as a student,
Sure.
so I knew that. And we as student editors, we were the worst. We thought we knew everything. And that's what happened to this paper. They wanted it revised and revised and revised.
Sure.
Anyway, it was eventually published, and it got 2 letters to the editor. One was from Skinner, who said, this is a terrible paper. Resnick knows better, etc. She's a turncoat. I can't remember the details. They're in there. They were published. The other came from the Linguist, who was very influential. It was at the other university up the street, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
MIT. Okay.
And his theories of language included a universal underlay of language that then got expressed in multiple ways in different languages. And so his theory was that all languages actually had the same basic units within them. He still might be right, but it isn't the most popular view among linguists anymore. A structuralist view of language.
Okay.
And he read the paper, not knowing me. I never met him, actually. And he wrote a letter to the editor that said, this is a really great paper, but it's really not worth trying to keep the Skinnerian view alive. So I hope Resnick will drop it as she moves on in her career, which I did.
Which you did.
Yeah, it wasn't his advice that led me to do it. It was.
You were already on your way at that
Yeah,
point of
right,
doing that.
I was,
That
yeah.
gave you a little stamp of validation,
Right.
though.
Yeah, right.
Tell us about your first academic position.
Well, it was a research job in the City University of New York, and I didn't like it very much, especially because they said when I became pregnant, I couldn't stay in it. And I said, why is that? Well, it's the rule. They couldn't claim it was not going to be good for my students because I was a researcher, not a student.
Sure.
So at that point, I took up an offer from somebody I'd met at a conference who had founded a company to use the Skinnerian methods to do training in other places than schools. And I began that work a few weeks after the baby was born. and worked for them for 3 years till we moved to Pittsburgh. It was very interesting.
And then you took a tenure track position here at the University of
Wasn't
Pittsburgh?
tenure track.
Oh, it wasn't?
It was the first. It was in the Learning Research and Development Center, funded by, I think there wasn't yet a Department of Education, so it was HEW. So it was in the move toward having a Department of Education. And they funded a string, I think 8 or 9 centers. And Bob Glazer,
Okay.
who was a young psychologist here at that time, got one of the first, maybe the first, of these centers. It was called LRDC. And I came here. Somebody directed me to him. I can't remember who. I walked into the office. He'd already read up on me. He said, "Okay, what do you want to do? You need a lab? Do you want this? Do you want that?" Etc. And he made me the offer and kept calling me every night for the next 2 weeks to see if I was going to accept it. And I finally did. But I also got offers. I mean, this is just as a sign of how different the world was.
Mm-hmm.
I also got an offer from Carnegie Mellon's psychology department. Okay, we've read your stuff, just come. And from the Pittsburgh Board of Education to join, or possibly to lead, I can't remember. It's statistical department, and from one of the think tanks that had a headquarters here at that time, no longer does. I took Bob's offer because it was the most welcoming and clear that I could do anything I wanted to, as long as it had to do with psychology and education.
And so what were the things that you wanted to do at this point when he kind of gave you carte blanche in terms of your research agenda?
Well, it led to a period. There was a period of exploring various things, but it led to a period of being very interested in math learning, and I think you've probably seen that in the CV. I'd forgotten about that, but it was about to become a very exciting time. We had a growing math education world, math education group growing up in the U.S. and in other countries, including not only Europe, but also some of the Asian countries and Latin American ones. And at this time, it still was going to take another decade to be translated into a form that English readers could easily access it. But the Vygotsky stuff was beginning to creep out of the Soviet Union via Scandinavia.
Okay.
And some of us were hearing about that. And linguistics was changing to a field that was understood to be structuralist, but not quite in the way before. It wasn't as tight. And computer science was beginning to make its rumbles about being able to say, build a chess machine that could beat the best chess players in the world, which indeed happened 30 years later.
Mm-hmm. But
all of that was coming together to produce what we know of as cognitive science. Philosophers were joining it too. It was a boiling pot of intellectuals of very different backgrounds who were managing to talk to each other, seeking each other out. And Pittsburgh was one of the centers of it.
Very interdisciplinary as well.
It was very interdisciplinary. It was very non-Ivy League. So it was good to be out of the Ivy League by that time.
Sure, sure.
It was Pitt and Carnegie Mellon joining, Carnegie Mellon being one of the leading places for the growth of computer science, Pitt being more humanistic and therefore better able at that time to develop theories of human understanding and knowledge. We can see Carnegie Mellon from here. It only takes 20 minutes to walk between the two campuses. That's even less than between Harvard and MIT. And it just turned out to be the best possible place for me.
So you eventually became an assistant professor. So did your
Yeah,
position?
I eventually did. It happened when I was on, in effect, sabbatical, even though I don't think I was eligible for a sabbatical because I was, no, I'm sorry, I was an assistant professor, but I didn't yet have tenure.
Sure.
So I was eligible for a sabbatical, and I was offered a pretty much a full, whatever the center at Stanford offered. They were looking for women at the time. They were you know which center I mean, Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences.
Okay.
Included psychology, eventually would include education as well, basically educational psychology. And it was really one of the places where careers were made for people in the social sciences. And psychology was borderline between social science and natural science. It was producing the next generation of great scholars. You got a year off to read and write. The only thing you were expected to do was have lunch every day with the rest of the crowd. And then if you wanted, play volleyball. But you didn't have to play volleyball.
Right.
But having lunch was pretty, it was
formative.
It was required, more or less, but everybody wanted to do it anyway, so it wasn't a problem. But they were having trouble identifying women. I found in that year Sandra, who was a psychologist from somewhere in the Northwest, and a sociologist much older than either of us from UCLA. So they not only accepted me, but my husband as well.
Is that right?
And we went with two kids who by that time were in middle school. And then every opportunity burst open after that, every kind of honor and funding source and invitation and so on.
So that was a pivotal point in your career.
That was another pivotal point.
So then after that you came back to Pittsburgh, because you've been here this is your 50th year of being here in Pittsburgh, is that correct? Okay.